The conflict in Syria is putting the lives of tens of millions of people at stake. But it's a war being waged by radical jihadists. And that means that for the religious minorities in the country, the Christians, the Jews, the Alawites, and the Druze, the stakes are even higher. Many of these groups have been hunted down and butchered by the Islamic terrorists in ISIS and Al-Qaeda, for whom the only victory in Syria is a religious crusade exterminating all opposition. And contrary to popular media and our politicians, the people of these groups aren't being targeted by the government.
Assad continues to kill and displace innocent Syrians, and in doing so has become the world's greatest single individual magnet for jihad and terror.
But in reality, these innocent civilians are fleeing by the millions to areas controlled by President Bashar al-Assad's forces, seeking protection from the terrorists who would slaughter them. That seems like a bit of a contradiction. If these rebels that we're supporting are fighting to free Syrian civilians, why are the civilians running from them in terror? I spoke with Kevork Almasian, a Syrian journalist and founder of Syriana Analysis.
The vast majority, they prefer to live under President Bashar al-Assad, and that explains the entire conflict. Why, for example, if an area is in the hands of the Syrian army, why don't the people escape to the rebel-held areas? Why always the refugees or the displaced people, they come to the government-held areas and not vice versa? I believe this explains the entire conflict.
These religious groups have become too afraid to practice their faiths openly. And now both Christians and Muslims say they're safer with President Bashar al-Assad in power.
The president is known for his care of not only the minorities but also the underdogs. He wants to make sure that people who need protection the most are protected. And that covers the Christians and others.
Dr. Hadi Yazigi is a medical doctor who trained at Damascus University at the same time as President Assad. He says that Assad is a moderating force and maintains peace between not only the Sunni Muslims, who make up a whopping 74% of the country's 18 million people, but other religions as well. Alawites make up a much smaller 12%, while just 10% of Syrians are Christian. But before the war broke out in 2011, and even now, most of these groups coexist happily. It's the radical terrorists who cause the problem, and Dr. Yazigi says that Syrians are fleeing from them and not from Assad.
If you look at the map, the war map right now, the areas under the control of the government are the areas where all of the internally displaced Syrians are moving to. So statistically, we have 4 million refugees who are outside Syria, and 8 million, almost twice as many, internally displaced Syrians. The vast majority of those who either decided to leave their homes voluntarily or were forced to leave their homes left to areas that are controlled by the government. So the president is protecting everybody. The Syrian government is protecting everybody.
Many in the West have the idea that Syria is a strictly Muslim country and that other religions aren't tolerated. Yet Syria has a vibrant Christian history. In fact, the first pope of the Catholic Church, St. Peter, was born in Syria, in a town that's now part of the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights.
Actually, in Syria, there are more than 22 or 23 religious sects and ethnicities. They are all living together for many centuries, even before Christianity. And the civilization of Syria goes back to 7,000 years from now. So the civilization is 7,000 years old. So we cannot say that Syria is Arabic or Islamic or Christian. It's a mixture of different civilizations and cultures.
But the peace for Christians and other religious minorities has turned into uncertainty in recent years. Since war broke out in 2011, Christians have been persecuted by radical Islamic terrorists. Those include terrorist groups such as the Islamic State, Al-Nusra Front, and Al-Qaeda, but also groups of so-called moderate rebels such as the Free Syrian Army or the Syrian Democratic Forces, both of whom have been heavily supported by the United States. In fact, the U.S. spent over $500 million arming these rebels, who then used those same weapons to massacre Christians and other civilians.
We gave 600 tons of weapons to the rebels, and they got weaker and weaker, and ISIS grew stronger. Perhaps by throwing all of these weapons into the civil war, we actually degraded Assad's ability to counter them. So perhaps Assad might well have taken care of the radical jihadists, and he can't because of the weapons.
The U.S. is supplying weapons to Kurdish rebels as well. In May, the Pentagon began sending small arms to Kurdish fighters, specifically those in the SDF, claiming the Kurds were the only force on the ground that could recapture Raqqa. But that ignores the reality on the ground, which is that the Kurds haven't traditionally been very friendly towards Christians or other religious groups.
The Christians have a very uneasy relationship with the Kurds. The Kurds have tended to discriminate against them. The Peshmerga Kurds have seized Christian lands that were traditionally theirs. They've basically stolen their homes, their property, and so forth.
The Pentagon insists the Peshmerga and the Kurdish fighters are one of the best chances the U.S. has to liberate Syria, and that they're the closest allies America has in the region. But that hasn't stopped the Kurds from viciously protecting what they claim as their territory from any and all outsiders, radical Islamists and Christians alike.
The Kurds in Syria are better than the Kurds in Iraq, but still they have engaged in ethnic cleansing of the Assyrian Christians in the northeastern parts of Syria, like Qamishli, Hasaka, for example. Recently, up to last year, they had some incursions and attacks on civilian populations in Hasaka, designed to scare away the population and drive them to leave their homes and vacate the homes so they can occupy them. Right now, the Kurds being militarily supported by the U.S. is really not helping the situation with other minorities. Not only they are treating the Sunni civilians in Raqqa in a brutal way, which the internet is full of documentation of that, but also they are targeting other minorities using now their military advantage.
And those are the friendly forces. Now, what about the Islamic State and other militants? How have they treated the Christians in Syria?
They're very brutal. For propaganda purposes, the United States separates ISIS from all of the other rebels. Problem is that all of the other rebels are tied to Al-Qaeda, the group that attacked us on 9/11.
Well, in areas where the government has lost control, there are numerous brutal examples of Islamic fighters massacring entire villages. Saddad is the ancient home of the Syriac Orthodox Christians, so old that it was referenced in the Old Testament. Most of the town's residents even speak Aramaic, the language of Jesus Christ.
The city of Saddad is the old and historical city mentioned in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the Torah. During all its history, it has been the center of religious study. Prominent monks and priests graduated in this center.
But that history and a lack of any strategic value didn't save the 600 Christian families who lived there. And in October of 2013, American-backed moderate rebels invaded the small desert village. CIA-sponsored militants in the Free Syrian Army, along with Al-Qaeda's al-Nusra Front, attacked with savagery, killing 45 Christians, including women and children. Many were tortured to death. The militants raided Saddad's ancient churches, destroying many of them in the process. They strangled villagers in the streets and tossed the bodies into wells and mass graves. The Free Syrian Army even released a video showing their soldiers celebrating the deaths of the Christians and the liberation of the city from President Assad. But for the Christians, there was no celebration. Religious leaders called it the worst massacre of Christians in years. 1,500 people were held hostage until the Syrian Arab Army, President Assad's forces, were able to rescue them.
When ISIS started an attack on our city, the Syrian army dealt with it. And we, as a group of inhabitants together with city residents and young church people, tried to feed the soldiers at the front line giving them meals we cooked. It is our thankful answer to them for the protection of our city.
And as terrible as that attack was, sadly, it wasn't isolated. Just 1 month before that, another ancient Christian city was mercilessly attacked by Islamic militants, including ISIS and rebels with funding from Washington. The town of Malula is one of the oldest centers of Christianity in the world. Aramaic is still spoken there fluently, and it's also home to 2 of the most important monasteries in Syria. It's sacred to Christians and Muslims alike, many of whom make a pilgrimage to worship in the village, which is designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But in September of 2013, the town's 2,000 residents came under assault from radical jihadists. The militants burned down churches, destroyed Christian artifacts, looted ancient sites, and murdered men, women, and children.
These so-called moderate rebels from the Free Syrian Army alongside Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda's military wing in Syria, they have invaded Malula. They have pushed away the Christians at the night. They all escaped from Malula, and some of them being killed by them and abducted by them, and especially the nuns inside the churches.
They even crucified villagers and locked bakers in their own ovens, burning them alive. And even as the residents burned and their town was destroyed, the U.S. insisted that these fighters were our allies. Residents tried to flee, but many were captured and ordered to convert to Islam. The rebels moved through the streets, executing Christians and leaving them where they fell.
We got up in the morning by their shouts. Allahu Akbar. We closed the doors and we gathered all in one room. They broke into the garden. They told us surrender and will not harm you. Antoine, Mikhail, and Shadi went there and surrendered. I heard my cousin outside saying he never held any weapons. I understood they pointed their guns at them. Then they started shouting and throwing bombs into the room. I was injured in my chest and fell to the floor. One of them offered to rescue me. I ignored him. Another one said, "Let them die."
And the men terrorizing the villagers were none other than the Free Syrian Army, the rebels paid and supplied by the United States.
The terrorist groups that attacked Malula consist mainly of the so-called Free Syrian Army and other factions that the West are now trying to recognize as moderate groups, when in fact they are terrorist groups that are armed and hired by al-Nusra and attacked Malula and killed her people and destroyed her churches.
America is supporting terrorism in this country. We've been fighting with the U.S., in fact, for several years, and now we can face them directly. But we are ready for that. We won't give in.
On September 6th, the Syrian army sent in reinforcements to take the village back. Tanks and thousands of President Assad's soldiers joined the battle, forcing the rebels to retreat.
So they have done horrible things in Malula. They have destroyed the infrastructure, the churches. They didn't succeed to destroy all the churches, but they have caused a huge destruction in these villages. And it was only the Syrian army and Lebanese Hezbollah who liberated this Malula, and they have pushed away these terrorists again from Malula.
Out of more than 2,000 original inhabitants, only 50 remain in the town, and they welcomed the government forces with open arms.
It is because of the Syrian Arab Army's achievements that no hostages will be left before ensuring they return to their families. And I hope we will celebrate victory soon.
God bless you. We're happy. Everything is fine again. Conditions are much better. Our monastery, this is our home. Thank God we came through all right, thanks to our president.
While President Obama carried out plans to arm these rebels, Christian groups in Syria formed militias to resist them. Yet Obama refused to provide them with weapons. Many were from communities displaced from the Nineveh plain after their homes were destroyed by moderate rebels and the Islamic State. Alawites have endured similar persecution, and in the spring of 2016, residents in the village of Zara suffered shocking violence at the hands of the terror group Ahrar al-Sham. The terror group calls for a strict form of Salafist Sunni Islam and fights with other jihadists like al-Nusra Front. Residents in Zara say the militants suddenly appeared in their village and claimed that most of them weren't from Syria. The Islamist raiders killed the elderly and took women and children captive, butchering entire families in their homes. At least 42 civilians were killed. Yet neither the United Nations nor the United States have been willing to call Ahrar al-Sham a terrorist group. In fact, the attack on Zara came after the U.S., along with help from Britain, France, and Ukraine, defeated a proposal from Russia to designate the group as a terrorist organization. In the wake of the attack, the U.S. State Department called the massacres unacceptable and incomprehensible, but refused to condemn the terrorists responsible. The U.S. even dismissed requests to blacklist the terrorists for their attack.
Is this specific group considered to be moderate opposition?
But again, I don't have the list of every group here, but Ahrar al-Sham is not designated as a terrorist organization inside Syria, and so therefore it is a group that that we have maintained a level of contact with in terms of discussing what this arrangement means going forward.
It's not clear why the United States government or other Western nations would be unwilling to designate these groups as terrorist organizations, or why they would continue supplying them with weapons, unless the goal wasn't to fight the terrorists, but instead to fight the legitimate, democratically elected Syrian government.
Many in the Syrian opposition are criminals, like the ones that conducted the recent violent killing in London. Do Europeans want to supply arms to these people? What will happen to these arms? Who will make sure they don't fall into the wrong hands?
According to Senator Rand Paul, giving these moderate rebels weapons is no different than handing them directly to radical jihadists.
Americans know that these weapons are going to the hands of the terrorists, but they also know that the moderates don't exist in Syria, and the only force willing to fight against Assad is Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
It sounds impossible that our own leaders in Washington could be behind such an effort. But if you listen to the politicians, the pieces start falling into place.
In Syria, we have ramped up our military assistance to the Syrian opposition. Tonight I call on Congress again to give us additional authorities and resources to train and equip these fighters. In the fight against ISIL, we cannot rely on an Assad regime that terrorizes its own people, a regime that will never regain the legitimacy it has lost. Instead, we must strengthen the opposition as the best counterweight to extremists like ISIL, while pursuing the political solution necessary to solve Syria's crisis once and for all.
The U.S. has a long history of flip-flopping on President Bashar al-Assad. We claim that Syria should determine its own future one month, and the next month we condemn Assad and say that Syria has no future with him as the leader, as if the United States has the authority to determine who should rule another country. So what would happen if Syria's government were overthrown? Washington has claimed their entire goal is to protect the people of Syria and to keep them from coming to harm. If we're worried about what happens to the Christians, the Alawites, the Jews, and other minorities, what is their fate if President Assad is deposed?
We get rid of Assad, yeah, there's a couple of groups there that are sort of democratic. You get rid of Assad, they're not the ones who are going to end up in charge of that government. Radical Islamic terrorists will be in charge of the Syrian government, and the Christians will be slaughtered by these people.
If Damascus falls, if President Bashar al-Assad and his government falls, Christians will be slaughtered. And we have had Saudi preachers who go around, they go to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, and to the UAE, and they preach, and they call for the murder of Christians, Jews, and Alawites. And so if we were to manage to topple Bashar al-Assad, we would see one of the greatest slaughters of Christians in all humanity.
But such warnings, followed by comprehensive reports from the U.S. State Department, haven't stopped Washington from pursuing an aggressive campaign to overthrow Syria's government.
Assad is going to have to leave in order for the country to stop the bloodletting and for all the parties involved to be able to move forward in a non-sectarian way. He has lost legitimacy in the eyes of a large majority of the country. Now, is there a way of us constructing a bridge creating a political transition that allows those who are allied with Assad right now, allows the Russians, allows the Iranians to ensure that their equities are respected, that minorities like the Alawites are not crushed, or retribution is not the order of the day.
But that goes against every piece of intelligence the U.S. has collected so far and flies in the face of every single account from actual residents in Syria. Not only that, but President Assad himself is an Alawite. Why would he be so eager to wipe out members of his own religion? Unless it's not actually about what Assad would or wouldn't do, but rather about what the U.S. would do. Many experts, including Kevork Almassian, believe it's part of a bigger plan that boils down to getting at Syria's vast mineral resources.
It's all geopolitics now, it's all business, it's all about money. So they don't really care about whether they are Christians or any other minorities. What's more important for them is that this shadow empire to continue, and these wealthy people in the United States and in other countries to become richer and richer.
Politicians turn the argument around, and instead of supporting the forces legitimately fighting terrorists, they claim the terrorists are allies, and the allies are terrorists.
And Russia has not even focused most of its efforts on al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda. 80 to 85% of their bombing has been done against the opposition, the moderate opposition, not the extreme, but the moderate opposition in Syria. And they do that in order to support Assad under the guise of fighting terror. But they would be hard-pressed to show the number of times they have actually gone after Daesh or ISIL, and hard-pressed even when the facts are laid out to show how they have in fact bombed Nusra as opposed to the legitimate opposition.
The legitimate opposition. The same legitimate opposition that massacred Christians and minorities in Malula, Sadat, Kasab, Raqqa, Aleppo, Idlib, Deir ez-Zor, Dara, Ghouta, Homs, Daraya, and Damascus, to name just a handful. Yet there are some U.S. lawmakers who don't buy Washington's story and say that Syria could get along a lot better if the U.S. would simply work with the groups actually targeting the jihadists.
Assad and the Russians were able, with their bombing, to kill the head of ISIL. This is a great thing for America to have the head of this radical Islamic terrorist organization totally taken out of action. We should be working in cooperation with them when they do that, rather than trying to overthrow the government because it's a dictatorship. Well, so are these other countries in the region who are our allies.
So far, U.S. involvement paints a grim picture of what will be left of Syria if we continue down this road. Past examples in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Egypt show that our track record is far from stellar. And perhaps the best solution for stability in the Middle East is a situation where the U.S. is a lot less involved.
Intervention that destabilizes the Middle East is a mistake. And yet here we are again, wading into a civil war. I warned a year ago that involving us in Syria's civil war was a mistake, that the inescapable irony is that someday the arms we supply would be used against us or Israel. That day's now. ISIS has grabbed up from the U.S., from the Saudis, from the Qataris, weapons by the truckload. And we are now forced to fight against our own weapons, and this body wants to throw more weapons into the mix.
It's perhaps worth mentioning that Senator Rand Paul, along with Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, have both put forward bills urging the U.S. to end its support for terrorist groups in Syria. And after months of waiting, Congress has yet to show any interest in signing these bills. With such a complicated situation and so many diverse groups, where exactly does the U.S. stand to gain from being involved? After spending billions of dollars and financing radical jihadists, what exactly are we getting for our tax dollars?
I don't see American interests involved on either side of this Syrian war. I see Assad, who has protected Christians for a number of decades, and then I see the Islamic rebels on the other side who have been attacking Christians. I see al-Qaeda on one side, the side we would go in to support, and I see it to be murky, and I don't see a clear-cut American interest.
In fact, many others, like Senator Black, say that not only are there no clear-cut American interests in Syria, but that by interfering, the U.S. has significantly damaged what could have been a great American ally.
We went in and we started this war to topple Syria. They had enjoyed 40 years of peace with Israel. They had the greatest women's rights of any Arab nation. They had the greatest religious freedom. They have religious freedom guaranteed 3 places in their constitution. And so they, in a sense, were the model of what Americans would hope that Arabia would become.
A good question to ask is this: if Syria's government is terrorizing its people, where are the pictures of Syrian soldiers beheading civilians or murdering Christians and Alawites? You won't find pictures of President Assad's forces smiling as they decapitate children, like the moderate rebels from Nur al-Zinki shown here. In fact, during the Battle of Aleppo, the U.S. even paid the salaries for these very fighters and gave them TOW anti-tank missiles, rifles, and ammunition. And despite Syrians' hopes that a change in the U.S. administration would help to mend ties, leaders in Washington aren't giving up on removing President Assad.
Assad's role in the future is uncertain, clearly, and with the acts that he has taken, it would seem that there would be no role for him to govern the Syrian people.
However, there have been glimmers that President Trump will turn the tables and the situation will improve. On July 20th, the president ordered an end to a covert CIA program to arm and train rebels fighting the Syrian government. The program was called Timber Sycamore. Its cancellation is one of the most significant developments for the war, representing a shift away from Obama's support for the so-called moderate rebels. It's also in keeping with President Trump's earlier campaign promises to wind down the war in Syria and focus all U.S. efforts on ISIS and other jihadists, and not on Syria's leadership. It follows the first meeting between Presidents Trump and Vladimir Putin, which many hope is a sign of new cooperation between the powers that could lead to an end to the war in Syria. And for many, that war was never about the people of Syria overthrowing their government, but instead about foreign powers interfering in Syria's sovereign right to govern itself.
It is a proxy war fought between major powers and neighboring countries on the Syrian soil, which Syrians have absolutely nothing to do with, and they are sick and tired of it. So they have had it, and they want Americans and America to know that, please, leave us alone. All they want to be is to be left alone. Once that stops, the war will end and the rebuilding will begin, and we will be happily ever after.
The bottom line is this: the U.S. has no clear interest in Syria and no verifiable evidence that President Assad is doing anything other than protecting his citizens from radical Islamists that we are paying for. The Syrian people are resilient, and the Syrian army has proven that when left alone, it can handle the terrorists. Now, perhaps the only thing that's really needed to defeat the jihadists is to stand back and have a little faith in Syria. For One America News, I'm Pearson Sharp.